There's a quote that you used from Webster about legal tender. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the reason I used that quote is because it pretty well summarizes what the Constitution says about the subject of money.
The essence of that is?
Yeah. Well, and it's basically that as far as the states go, they can not issue paper money, and the only thing they can do is make gold or silver a legal tender. And with regard to the federal government, since the only power it's given is the power to coin money, it doesn't have any power to issue paper legal tender.
Can't print money.
Can't print money because the power is to coin money, or to also to regulate the value of foreign coins, which actually is what the first Congress did. They basically took a sampling of all Mexican silver dollars that were in circulation at the time and determined kind of the average weight, because in those days, I mean, coins circulated for a long time and they got worn down a little bit, and so you just figured out the average weight of the Mexican silver dollar, the pieces of 8 that were in circulation, and that became the weight of the US dollar, which was, once the world went on the gold standard early in the 19th century, they basically did a translation to the gold weight, and for most purposes that became the dollar. And that's why the silver weight lasted until we gave up the silver dollar in the 60s, kind of thing.
Right.
The weight in silver never changed.
371 and a quarter grains of fine silver.
The weight in gold changed, but the weight in silver never
Was
changed.
Webster arguing for a legal tender, or was he saying legal tender is not necessary?
The interesting thing is that the debate was on what was called the Specie Circular, and it came about the time of Andrew Jackson's battle with the Second Bank of the United States. And I believe, I'd have to go back and look to be absolutely sure about this, but in that period, Webster was almost certainly also the lawyer for the bank. I mean, he had a number of conflicts of interest in terms of, which is why he got into so much trouble after the 7th of March speech. But in those days, the monetary argument, the way you won it, was to paint your opponent as being in favor of paper money. In other words, both sides of the debate were clearly for gold, silver as legal tender. And that's why the beginning of that quote, it was just so long I couldn't do the whole thing in a speech. Webster defines currency. And he basically says, you know, currency can be almost anything that settles debts between people and businesses. You know, whatever adjusts and settles balances.
Whatever people agree to.
In commercial context.
Yeah.
Then he goes on, but if by money you mean the legal tender, the constitutional standard value, then it can be nothing but gold or silver.
Right. It's not paper or anything of that nature.
It's not paper, and I used it because, I mean, Webster was basically, let me put it this way, I think the number is right, he argued 170 cases in the Supreme Court. Nobody's ever come close since, including some of the most famous cases. But his most famous argument, I suppose, was the reply to Hayne, where Webster was arguing that the Union, that the United States was basically a compact of the people, and that you know, it really wasn't just a compact among states. So that states, he was arguing against Calhoun's theory that it was a compact, an agreement among states, and individual states could secede. And so it became kind of the argument that Lincoln adopted in saving the Union. Because if you read the Constitution, you might just, you know, even a careful reading of it, say, well, this could be interpreted as a compact among states. It got ratified state by state. And so Webster, in his reply to Hayne, had gone into some detail about the history of the Revolution and so on and so forth, and maintained that, you know, it was a union. And then Webster in 1850 came out in support of the Compromise of 1850, which was kind of a compromise in terms of new states, slave states versus. But it was also an issue of enforcing the Fugitive Slave Clause, which required that slaves be returned, you know, if they basically escaped from the South and were in the North somewhere, which of course in Massachusetts there were plenty of abolitionists and were harboring fugitive slaves.
Yeah, this is when Thoreau wrote his famous civil disobedience and ended up going to jail for refusal to pay the tax that ultimately was to be used for, as I understood, recall from reading it, helping to assist in returning slaves back to the South that were captured in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and part of the compromise was that we're going to have to, you know, enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause, which was at that time part of the Constitution.
Yeah.
And Webster's argument on the 7th of March, which was sort of his last big performance in the Senate, was essentially that, you know, we've got to make this compromise, and that the Fugitive Slave Clause was part of the Constitution, and you didn't get to pick which part you were going to abide by and which part you weren't, that you had to enforce the whole thing. And for that, he was basically pilloried at home by what was probably the greatest collection of literary lights that ever took on any individual politician. And he essentially lost any chance he might have had to be president, which of course is...
He was that popular at that time.
Well, I don't know, you know, some people read Stephen Vincent Benet's The Devil and Daniel Webster.
Yeah.
And he's described as, no, he was never president, but for most of the 1830s and 40s, up to his death, I think in 1852, he was the biggest man in the country, is the way it was put. And I think for the next half century after his death, he was by far the most quoted politician in Congress, in congressional debates. But he's sort of been eclipsed a little bit in the 20th century. But again, it's because he was a conservative, a Federalist.
Federalist as the framers of the Constitution intended it.
Yes, and so, you know, he wouldn't have fit in very well with the notion of the welfare state, I guess is one way to put it.
Well, the quote was an excellent quote. The presentation you gave was brilliant. And the good news is that it's available on goldensextant.com, which is your website. So what's the title of the speech so that when they go to the website, they'll know where to look?
At the website, the title is Constitutional Money, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And the version that will be at the website has a number of footnotes and even some supplementary material that's you can get to in PDF from the website, because, you know, the speech had a 20-minute limit, whatever.
Yeah.
And the idea was to provide quite a bit more support for some of the things I said. And also, I think that there's some history in there. There's a bit about Webster that I wrote. There's a copy of the petition that I had to the Supreme Court to try to deal with monetary issues in the first case that I mentioned. So there's a lot of stuff there. There's even the correspondence that I had with the Harvard Law School professors. So people can, you know, sort of see the bigger picture from that.
Well, that's great, Reg. I'm going to be going into the website as well and look at some of those links, because this is a favorite subject of mine, the whole constitutional money issue. Reg Howe, goldensextant.com. Thank you very much. I really appreciated the opportunity to speak with you about the presentation you gave at the GATA conference here. Thank you.